Let's meet our guest. For 15 years, he was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He's the author of books including War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, Death of the Liberal Class, and Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. Journalist, author, activist, Chris Hedges.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us so much today, Chris. I have been looking forward to talking to you for a long time, in part because, as you are well aware, there is a certain, heterodoxy in the media. And those of us who occupy the broad left, it can be a very isolating experience in general. But when I listen to you, there are a few figures who I listen to who I feel I have as much identity of spirit and politics with. So I wanted to ask you to see if you could weigh in on some of the issues we've been trying to work through on this podcast about what the left should do in this moment, in the midst of a Biden administration that doesn't meet the needs of the moment. And at a time when a lot of the kind of active spirit of last summer and the spirit of pushback that existed under Donald Trump has largely dissipated, even among some factions of the left who seem to have adopted the view that all that needs to be done, or the bulk of what needs to be done in this moment, is to kind of rally around the progressive members of Congress, work hard to elect more progressive members of Congress, and to kind of abstractly organize. At the same time, there's a acknowledgement that organizing is very difficult right now, given low union participation rates and the absence of the kind of structures that the left broadly used to be able to rely on. So what do you make of this current moment, and what our priorities should be for advancing some of the issues like climate change, for instance, that really can't wait?
Well, I think it's important to recognize, and I think the $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, the American Rescue Plan, kind of made this clear, that the Biden administration and the Democratic Party have no intention of addressing the structural inequalities. They wouldn't even raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. They won't impose taxes or regulations on corporations with a billionaire class, which saw its wealth increase by $1.1 trillion since the start of the pandemic. They have used the bill to funnel tens of millions of dollars to our for-profit healthcare system, rather than reforming that system and establishing single-payer universal healthcare for all. It has its language, its bellicosity, both in the Middle East, towards Iran, towards China, has, I think, illustrated that they will not cut this bloated military budget. All of the structural issues that created the massive social inequality that gave rise to a figure like Trump are not being addressed, and that's very dangerous. This kind of sending out checks for $1,400 to about 280 million Americans, extending unemployment benefits at $300 a week until the end of August, giving this tax credit. I think it's $3,600 for a child under the age of 6, $3,000 for children between 6 and 17, starting in July. All of this money is going to get swallowed by landlords and lenders and medical providers and credit card companies. So it's a one-off. And that frightens me, because I think it's this social inequality that gave rise to a figure like Trump, the betrayal by the Obama administration. And so when you talk about the left, I think the Democratic Party has been quite effective, not just in the last presidential campaign, but going back, all the way to the Bush administration, in frightening progressives in the left into backing a party that is a wholly owned subsidiary of corporate America.
So part of that is the idea that everyone should vote blue no matter who, which, we've talked about on this podcast a lot. You're one of the few people who didn't kind of fall in line and encourage people to vote for Joe Biden. I wrote an article last year about the need for some kind of litmus test, and, making the, I think, pretty obvious argument that if you declare kind of a priori that you're going to vote for whomever has a D next to their name, no matter who they are, what they do, whether they're a Bloomberg figure that might as well be Republican, and there's a credible argument that they could be even worse than Trump, then what does it mean? What are we saving the country from exactly? And as I'm sure you're aware, that kind of argument gets a lot of pushback, right?
Yeah.
What would you say? It feels like we keep coming up against the same issue, including over the $15 minimum wage, where there are these tension points where either elected representatives or people, organized masses of people themselves, can withhold the vote, can force a vote on something like Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House or on the $15 minimum wage to gum up the works in the way that moderates like Joe Manchin seem to have no hesitation to do. Do you think it's necessary for us to progress, to be willing to draw those kinds of lines in the sand, to adopt some kind of litmus test and be willing to be more adversarial in our approach?
Well, we should have done that a long time ago. So 1994, the Clinton administration passes NAFTA, which is the greatest betrayal of the American working class since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. And we should have walked out on the Democratic Party then. What Clinton and Tony Coelho and others did is transform the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. Obama picked Biden as his vice president because he votes Republican. He in essence, is a Republican. His long years in Congress have illustrated that. I mean, even to the point where he was anti-busing and has called for cuts in Social Security and the horrific crime bill that exploded our prison population and militarized our police. Biden was instrumental, including writing the Patriot Act. So the problem with progressives on the left is that they never draw a line in the sand and they keep walking backwards. And each administration gets worse. I mean, what Clinton did is transform the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, the party of law and order, the party of aggressive foreign policy and wars, the party of austerity. It was Clinton that destroyed our welfare system. It's Clinton that deregulated the FCC and allowed a half dozen corporations to seize control of the airwaves. It's Clinton that ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks by revoking the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act. All of that was Clinton. Obama's assault on civil liberties, of course, continuing the Clinton policies. I mean, there's complete continuity on almost every issue between Bush and Obama. With this exception, Obama's assault on civil liberties were worse than those under Bush, his misuse of the Espionage Act. So the problem with progressives on the left is they don't stand for anything. And that has hollowed out the left. I have not voted for a Democratic candidate since 2000, when I started voting for Nader and eventually was Ralph's speechwriter. And I think Ralph was right, that at that point, the only way to put pressure on the Democratic Party was to pull 5, 10, 15 million people away into a third party and force the Democrats to respond. Politics is a game of fear. And we just don't have any counterweight. And because we don't have any counterweight, the country has undergone what John Ralston Saul calls a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. And it's over. We get to pick which wing of the corporate party we want. We want this nativist, racist, Islamophobic wing flying the Confederate flag, or do we want the polite Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden wing that talks about diversity, but only diversity in terms of those who are willing to serve this system, which is just a species of corporate colonialism.
I just want to clarify one point. You mentioned that Obama's violations of civil liberties were more egregious than Bush's. By what metric?
Well, first of all, the use of the Espionage Act to shut down whistleblowers, misuse, up until the Obama administration. It's a 1917 act passed by Woodrow Wilson, the equivalent of our British Foreign Secrets Act. So it's designed to punish people who give information to a hostile power. It's not designed to go after whistleblowers like John Kiriakou or Edward Snowden. Obama used that 9 times during his administration. Obama misinterpreted the 2002 authorization to use Military Force Act as allowing the executive branch to serve as judge, jury, and executioner and carry out targeted assassinations through militarized drones against U.S. citizens. It was Obama that passed Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act that overturned the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act and permits the U.S. military to act as a domestic police force. All of that came under Obama.
In, I believe, 2012, you as a private citizen sued the Obama administration. Could you describe for our audience what that lawsuit was about and how it
that was over Section 1021 of the NDAA. Obama signed it into law at midnight, the last day of 2011, I guess assuming nobody would notice. And the lawyers, Bruce Afron and Carl Mayer and I, took it to federal court, the Southern District Court of New York, and we sued the Obama administration. We didn't think we were going to win. We just did not want that further erosion of constitutional protection and that firewall that prohibited the military from being deployed to American streets. And I should add, being empowered to carry out extraordinary rendition of U.S. citizens, stripping them of due process and habeas corpus, which that section allows them to do. And we won. We won, and the Obama administration immediately appealed and sent it to the Second Circuit. And then the Second Circuit waited because it's a clear black and white constitutional issue. So it put the Second Circuit in a difficult position, and they waited until there was a Supreme Court ruling in Clapper versus Amnesty International, which is about wholesale government surveillance, especially of journalists. This was all done before Snowden. That got to the Supreme Court. The government lawyers argued that I and the other plaintiffs had no concern. Well, yeah, no concern, legitimate concern, and that the government would tell us if we were being surveilled, which we now know is ridiculous. And so they threw it out, saying we didn't have standing. And then the Second Circuit said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he does not have standing in Hedges versus Obama. And so it's law. Yeah. But that was Obama.
It's always standing, isn't it? It's
always standing. Yeah. Exactly. So, I mean, what's happened is that our constitutional rights have been stripped of us by judicial fiat. And you're exactly right. The way that the courts, which are wholly owned subsidiaries of corporate America, function is that they deny us standing. That's exactly right. I mean, the whole Citizens United, interpreting Citizens United as the right to petition the government or a form of free speech, is just a complete inversion of constitutional rights.
Yeah, and for, non-lawyers and normal people,
me,
standing is the notion that you have to have some not attenuated relationship to the claim to bring it, right? The idea is you don't want me as a random person saying person A and got hit by a car by person B, and so I'm going to sue on behalf of person A. I have no relationship to them. Ostensibly, it's supposed to mean that you have some relationship to the claim you're bringing. But what often happens, for example, in environmental cases, is you'll say, well, I don't want them to drill in the park in my city. And the court will say, sure, I guess maybe on the books you have a claim, but you can't prove that you have a relationship to that park. Were you planning to go to the park? Do you use the park? You live 4 blocks away from the park, so you're not really that close to the park, and they'll get rid of your claim on those kinds of grounds, and it happens often.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about this $15 minimum wage again, because as you mentioned, it was the most structural aspect of the relief bill. It would have been had it been included. And it doesn't feel like an accident that is the part that didn't make the cut. The part that would have actually lasted beyond 3 months or 6 months or the end of this crisis. And I'm curious if there was anything you would have liked to have seen differently from progressives, whether in the Senate or the House, that might have resulted in a different outcome, given that you're someone who has used the courts, who have used these kind of Nader-esque tools at your disposal, untraditional tools at your disposal to make yourself heard?
Well, we should have surrounded the Capitol and demanded $15 minimum wage. That would be the only way to begin to frighten the power elites into responding. And you're right. Everything in this bill is temporary. And so what happens when, in a few months, this government support is gone? What are people supposed to do when the checks don't arrive anymore? Are they going to pass another federal government massive relief bill? I don't think so, given the configurations of Congress and Mitch McConnell and the cautiousness of the Biden administration. And so we're going to be right back to where we started.
Well, all the progressives now are tweeting and live streaming and saying, the fight's not over. We've got to push. And I think, understandably, a lot of progressive individuals, voters, citizens are responding kind of cynically. Like, why are you saying organize? Why aren't you saying something more concrete? Why aren't you, telling us to meet at a certain point in protest? Why aren't you, asking, why aren't you naming Joe Biden? Why aren't you naming the figures that are responsible for this not being included in the bill? In short, why are you acting like you're one of us instead of someone with a relatively, large amount of power and authority? You're an actual legislator. But making those kinds of criticisms of these figures, it's divisive. And there are some on the left who say, we're already so small. We've already taken this blow, the blow of Bernie Sanders not winning. We can't have this kind of infighting. What do you think the approach should be toward these progressive members of Congress who obviously are so much better than, the Pelosi's of the world and the corporate Dems that we're used to, but who still seem to not be calling upon the public to do the sorts of things that you think would move the ball forward meaningfully?
Well, they don't have any power. I mean, as Pelosi has kind of pointed out more than once, if you talk about the squad, how many people are you talking about? 5 people? They have no power. With the power of the Democratic Party, the reason Schumer and Pelosi have so much power is they're the funnels for the money that goes to the anointed candidates. And if you run afoul of them, you don't have any money, and your campaign, your ability to get reelected or elected is almost nil. In the case of Bernie Sanders, what was accepted, I was very critical of Bernie, by the way, on a couple points. First of all, I never believed that the Democratic Party was ever going to allow him to have the nomination, and he should have broken out and started a third-party movement, even though he wouldn't have won. It's going to take longer than an election cycle for us to build a viable third party. And secondly, Sanders just wouldn't take on the military-industrial complex, which has to be dismantled if we are going to address the social inequality and the suffering that now afflicts tens of millions of Americans, probably at least half the country. I mean, let's go back and look at the Sanders campaign. You had Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, making it very clear, along with other major Democratic Party donors, that if somehow Sanders got the nomination, they would vote for Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump was an embarrassment to the empire. They wanted to restore the kind of decorum and gravitas that an Obama had or even a Bush had, and that Trump had destroyed, and that Biden would. But they could live with Trump. They could live with the Trump policies. And so I worry about the left. I mean, I think the left has to stand unequivocally with those people within the country who have been dispossessed and against the Democratic Party. Otherwise, especially among the white working class, we are going to see another Trump, if not Trump, perhaps a competent Trump. I mean, we must remember that the elites embodied by figures like Biden, Clinton, Bush, in both parties, the lies that the elites told to the American public about the consequences of NAFTA, of trade deals, of dismantling welfare, Glass-Steagall, austerity measures, deregulating Wall Street, these horrific crime bills, the endless wars in the Middle East, the bailing out of the big banks and Goldman Sachs rather than the victims of their fraud. These lies were far, far more damaging to the public than any of the lies told by Trump. And I think that what's happened is that the elites have been found out, that there's a loss of credibility. And this isn't just within the United States. You see it because these policies are global. These global speculators have seized control, in essence, of not only the American economy, but most economies. And that's why Biden's a dangerous figure, because what Biden and those around him are attempting to do is recreate the ancien regime, to go back to this kind of utopian conservatism. And it isn't going to work. In 1932, in Germany, the traditional conservative class gathered around von Papen because they were terrified of the rise of the Nazis and tried the same thing, and it failed. And that is what is so frightening. And I think the elites don't get that it's over. And you see their tremendous loss of credibility is a loss of political influence. That's right. So you see all these people outside the mainstream. Alex Jones. Of course, I detest Alex Jones, but figures like Joe Rogan or Matt Taibbi or Glenn Greenwald. These people who weren't groomed by the media conglomerates and who speak outside of that power circle. I mean, look at CNN, look at MSNBC, even Fox. They're just courtiers. I mean, they spin it from one angle or another, but they're like courtiers at Versailles. And meanwhile, most of the country, which is suffering, has been rendered invisible. This has been, of course, true for poor people of color for decades, but it's also true for the white working class, which I'm not defending the way that's often expressed, but that the suffering is real. And my family comes from working class towns in Maine that have been utterly destroyed. The mills are gone, and the town where my grandparents are from, the bank is boarded up, and there's methamphetamine clinics all over the place. This suffering is real, but unacknowledged by corporate media. And so we're entering a really dangerous moment, which has all been exacerbated by COVID. So, I mean, if you look at just the figures that are out there, and this bill, of course, does nothing to address this. You have this was last year before COVID, 50% of the households accounted for 1% of the nation's wealth, and the top 10% have 76% of the wealth, which is, it's now worse. 18 million Americans depend to survive on unemployment benefits, and businesses are falling, small businesses are falling right and left. 81 million Americans can't meet their basic household expenses. 22 million lack enough food on a daily basis. 11 million can't make their next house payment. These are the real kind of New Deal structural issues that, if we don't address, will bring a very frightening blowback.
Over the past year, you warned of an impending eruption of violence, that the Trumpist right was increasingly unbound by social or legal norms. When the Capitol was stormed on January 6th, did you feel vindicated?
Well, no, I felt horrified. It's not something I wanted to see. I know these people. I've spent a lot of time with them. Going back 10 years ago, I wrote a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right in the War in America. That was 2 years inside their mega churches and their creationist seminars and right to life weekends. So I know these people, and they are frightening. And I didn't use the term fascist lightly. I think that and I speak as a seminary graduate and grew up in the church. My father was a minister. They are, it's a heretical form of Christianity that has fused the worst aspects of American capitalism and nationalism with the symbols of the Christian religion, which is exactly what the pro-Nazi German Christian church did in Germany. I don't want to see what I think is come. I mean, that's part of the reason I speak out. But I think that the violence, I worry about political assassinations when people like this feel cornered, and we've had several near misses. But one day they're going to succeed. There are so many echoes of Yugoslavia. I covered the breakdown of Yugoslavia and the war in Yugoslavia for the New York Times. I see many, many echoes of that, which was driven by financial, economic collapse.
So how do you see us getting out of this then? Because, when I ask the question about, progressives, it's not to pretend that they have the ability to wave a magic pen and pass a $15 minimum wage, which is sometimes how it's characterized. But it also kind of can feel like there is an absence of accountability if you don't acknowledge that there is a kind of power that exists by leveraging their enormous popularity and the fact, among people outside of Congress, outside of Capitol Hill. And that when you say things like, we should have been rallying outside of Congress, we should have been protesting for $15 minimum wage. These are all people, Senator Sanders included, who at various times have used their text message platforms and their online platforms to urge people to participate in mass protest events exactly of that sort, but who have declined to do so in this moment. Is that something that we should be expecting of public figures like this? And if not them, who should we be looking to? Because it feels like there's a real void. A lot of talk, I think, that's well intended and correct about the need to organize, but also this feeling that it would be impetuous of any given person to step into that role, that we want leaderless movements, that a lot of people who are well positioned to do that work are just choosing not to. And that's what's leaving a lot of people, I think, feeling really unsettled.
Yeah, I mean, no movement is leaderless, but there is a danger of having a very hierarchical leadership. I spent a lot of time in Zuccotti Park with Occupy. I think it would be wrong to call Occupy leaderless, but it was leadership by consensus. And it wasn't dependent on one particular leader. The engine of Occupy, at least in New York, was the Direct Action Committee. I don't know how many people were on it. Not a lot, probably under 20. And they really set the agenda. So we can't look to political leaders. I mean, Bernie Sanders has made it very clear that he will dance to the tune that Chuck Schumer plays. I think that was Bernie's political mistake, although Bernie's not wrong. I actually spoke to Bernie about it with Shama Sawant, the Socialist City Councilwoman. We did an event the night before the climate march, before he announced in 2016, and Shama in particular really pushed him to run as a third party, and Bernie's answer was, I don't want to end up like Nader. Now Bernie's not wrong. He would have ended up like Nader. The Democratic Party would have destroyed him and turned him into a pariah, and he just wasn't willing to pay that political price. And he, was a loyal member of the Schumer wing of the Democratic Party for 4 years, and I would argue that they did to him in 2020 exactly what they did in 2016, which was pull every dirty trick they could in the book, including on the eve of, was it South Carolina or North Carolina, getting everybody to withdraw. That was Obama, to make sure that Biden was the nominee. But we can't look to figures like Sanders. We have to look for people outside formal systems of power. And we have to begin to stand with the working class and be willing to sacrifice and even be marginalized. Because if we don't, especially the white working class, is going to get funneled into the hands of these proto-fascists. And I think that is the mistake of the left and progressives. I mean, the old radicals, the old communists, the old wobblies, even the old socialists, the old CIO, they wouldn't have played this game with the Democrats. And we have to stop playing it as well.
Have you given any thought to how to get around the obvious media narrative that says, we all heard it. If you don't play the game, if you don't vote for Biden, you are enabling fascism. You are enabling Trump. I think I'm in complete agreement with you about the power. Obviously we're all powerless. Everything's terrible. Yes, but to the extent that there does seem to be something that the corporate parties are afraid of, it is third parties, and you see it in all of the ways that they work to disempower them further. You see it in the ways that they make villains out of figures like Ralph Nader and Jill Stein. And way farther down the list, random people who were anonymous but happened to vote for Jill Stein in 2016. So I'm asking this question because I'm curious how you get a meaningful number of people to actually do that in a way that can be framed, not like you are the one throwing the country to Trump, you are the one who's indifferent to the needs of the marginalized, et cetera, which is what goes on now and how third party voters are characterized now. But the Democratic Party had a choice to meet our needs, and it chose fascism instead, because meeting our needs meant undermining the oligarchy in a way that they were not willing to compromise on. have you given thought to how, as a media person, how we can start to win that rhetorical battle?
Well, if we do step out and challenge the ruling elites, and in particular the Democratic Party ruling elites, those are the nice things they're going to say about us. I think that, in fact, part of the problem with the left, it is no relationship. And this, I would exclude the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, which I found very heartening, not only because of their courage to go out into the streets, but also because they weren't gaslighted. I wasn't there, but I sensed a political sophistication that I found very, very heartening. They didn't care whether Nancy Pelosi wore a kente scarf or the mayor of Washington painted 35-foot high letters on a street saying Black Lives Matter at the same time she was calling for a $50 million increase in the police budget. They didn't care if cops took the knee. They got it. So I think the part. Let's talk about the white liberal class, which is the majority. They don't know people in prison. They don't know people in the inner cities. They don't have any relationship with the oppressed. The oppressed are an abstraction. So I've taught in the New Jersey prison system for a decade. Half of my students would not be in that prison but for Biden and Clinton. And how can I walk out of the prison and vote for Biden? Destroyed their lives, destroyed the lives of their families, destroyed the lives of their children, impoverished and destroyed their communities, inflicted reigns of terror, and terror is not the wrong word in these communities, corrupted a court system so that everyone is coerced, and I mean coerced, to take plea deals, often for crimes they didn't commit. I mean, look at Chicago. I mean, Chicago, in terms of torture, is like Guatemala or Israel. I mean, there's another one. I mean, I heard Obama, I spent 7 years in the Middle East for the New York Times and months of my life in Gaza. I'm an Arabic speaker. I heard Obama, when he was running, give this speech to AIPAC, and I thought, I don't care if I'm the only person in America, I am not betraying the Palestinian people. I am not voting for him. Especially when Ralph was running. And so we have to begin to stand firm around these moral issues that have inflicted such misery on people within the country, and that's the first step. But we're not there yet.
And yet, most of those people from those protests, I would suggest to you, Chris, did go ahead and vote for Biden. I think it was great that the protests were multiracial. Some people say that it was an indictment of the protests. I disagree with that. But I think the reality is that those legions, millions globally, but locally, millions of people who are participating in those protests, at the end of the day, never connected the demands to the Biden agenda and never threatened to withhold their vote. So at the same time, there were millions of people in the street last summer. We had the DNC, the National Convention, where Democrats were talking about how they were also tough on crime, how defund the police was going to get Trump reelected. You had Joe Biden in the leaked tape with civil rights leaders just weeks after he was elected, being roundly dismissive of every senior civil rights actor in the country. And then when the tape was leaked, when the call was leaked, no pushback, no embarrassment from the participants in the call, who basically, people I have enormous amount of respect for, like Sherrilyn Ifill, who pushed back against Biden in that call more than others, who ultimately was ignored. And she said, here are executive actions. Here's things you can do for criminal justice issues that you can do independently with executive authority. And Joe Biden says, I'm not going to use my executive authority. And also, defund the police is bad. A complete non sequitur. But clearly that's a touchstone that he likes to go to. So it's not that I doubt the concern level or credibility of the people in the streets, but the missing link, it seems to me, is connecting that anger to some kind of electoral political agenda and making it so that there are consequences for ignoring millions of people in the street. Because right now, that doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, that's exactly right. We should all take a lesson from Cornel West. When they disrespect you, walk out, which is what he just did at Harvard, number one. Number two, my students and their families can't vote. They all have felony convictions.
Yeah.
So I suspect, and this is just hypothetical, that a lot of those people in the streets who can vote came from a different economic strata. It may not have been a hugely different economic strata, but a different economic strata from the students that I teach in the prison. And what I'm saying is that, if my students can't vote, if my students live and their families under reigns of police terror, if my students never got a fair trial, and of course, almost nobody in this country gets a fair trial unless they have a lot of money. If my students' lives are condemned, then we have to stand with them. And we have to stand against the people, including Joe Biden, who did this to them. That's the problem. That is the fundamental problem. And that means stepping outside the system. And when you step outside the system and you really stand with the oppressed, you're going to get treated like the oppressed. And that is the only way forward.
From a recent article of yours, none of these groups or individuals, whether they are on the left or on the right, however, have the organizational structure, coherence, and ideological cohesiveness of radical movements of the past, including the old Communist Party or militant labor unions. They traffic in emotional outrage, often replacing one outrage with another. They provide new forms of identity to replace the identities lost by tens of millions of Americans who have been cast aside. That's a very succinct and I would say very true look at the radicalism that has increased, percolated in the past 10 years. My question then is, what would a left movement, what organizational structure, ideology would make an effective left movement?
Well, one that understands the configurations of power and grasps that reform is not going to come from the Democratic or the Republican Party, that we have undergone what John Ralston Saul correctly calls a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, and it's over. And it's a matter of reading power. And I think a lot of these groups, however well-meaning, have failed to read power. They still think that, despite, for instance, all of Obama's policies, that somehow he's receptive to a progressive agenda, which he never was. First of all, he's a product of the Chicago political machine. Remember, when Obama was a state senator, there was all that stuff with Burge and the torture in Chicago. Obama never said a word and then came out and backed Daley's re-election campaign. And Daley had been the attorney general when we're talking about dozens and dozens of people were being tortured with electric cattle prods and electric shocks and, beaten, severely beaten and suffocated with plastic bags, especially in Area 2 in Chicago. So, we have to embrace a radicalism. Lenin said, we have to be as radical as reality itself. And what he meant by that is when you look at with the cold lens of what your government does, and not just what it does to poor people, but what it's doing to Muslims in the Middle East, what it does within our prison system, what it does to children who go to bed hungry, then you have to respond with the same kind of radicalism. And we need to recover that radicalism going forward, which means really accepting, certainly becoming a pariah. And with the ability of the surveillance state to monitor us, this will be very, very difficult, but it is absolutely imperative. I mean, as soon as the Democrats caved on the minimum wage, we should have rung the Capitol with tens of thousands of people, and because that's the only way these people are going to respond. And I saw communist regimes. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. 500,000 people in Alexanderplatz outside the Communist Party headquarters. 500,000 people in Wenceslas Square in Prague. Even the most despotic regimes are frightened. And then I covered Romania, where the crowd turned on the Ceausescus and they couldn't get to the roof fast enough to get a helicopter out of there. That's what we got to do.
It's difficult. I mean, it was hard enough before just on a logistical basis. But now, post 1/6, I feel like there's this whole weird valence to any calls to do that, which suggests that you are you're comparable to the right-wing insurrectionists. I personally have been called in at least 2 articles now, sympathetic to the right, or wanting to accused of, wanting to take a cue from the right, because I agree that a certain level of direct action is going to be necessary. And maybe the answer is just ignore it. Who cares? They're going to say what they're going to say. But I think who's going to make the call is basically the issue. Like, who is going to be the one that directs folks to go and protest? Because it's obvious that as much as squad members and progressives are willing to say, give to this, Act Blue account to fundraise for people suffering from the power going out in Texas, or Hunts Point activism, all these good, wonderful, positive things. And they might even say, come participate in, a friendly pride event or something like that. They aren't willing to so much as say the name of their colleague that is obstructing mass benefit of, programs like $15 minimum wage, much less say come protest them actively. And all of the hope that we had in the AOCs of the world, who opened their tenure in Congress by participating in a sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office, I don't see that coming from them. I also don't see it coming from certain left organizations, including DSA, who, I learned in the Force the Vote debacle that they don't ideologically support mass marches at the Capitol because it's expensive. Organizations like NNU, others who have been the leaders of the Medicare for All fight, chose in that moment not to choose that lane of activism. Maybe they might at some point in the future, but it doesn't exactly inspire confidence that they will. So that's the issue. It's not that I disagree at all about the approach, but I think where I'm stuck, and where a lot of people are stuck, is that there doesn't seem to be anybody well-positioned. Black Lives Matter leaders, in many ways, the figureheads who have been identified with Black Lives Matter are very much enmeshed with the establishment. And you see them, I don't mean this as an attack, but you see people like Tamika Mallory performing at, what was it, the Grammys last night or the night before, as part of like a Black Lives Matter themed musical performance, right?
Right.
There has been a lot of commodification of the protests from last summer.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I mean, but can you imagine Malcolm X doing that?
I really hope not, but time is a beast.
I can assure you that it wouldn't happen.
So where's Malcolm? Where's the new Malcolm?
Probably locked up.
Oh dear.
I mean, you should see the students I have. I teach to Rutgers. I mean, I've said it many times, and people think I'm just being nice to black people, but it's totally true. My students could bury the kids I've taught at Princeton. There's no comparison. The whole level of discussion begins at a place the kids in Princeton are not even cognizant of, because they don't even know how to ask the questions. Because these people understand America. They understand the judicial system. They understand white supremacy. They know institutional racism. They know why the police are militarized. And it has nothing to do, of course, with justice. It's because these places have been stripped of all meaningful employment, and prisons and police are the 2 primary forms of social control. They're locked up. I mean, they're locked up, especially if they're of color. And the other point you make is very important about what happened on the 6th, because what was the response of the corporate state after the 6th? It was to criminalize speech, and not for the right wing. 205 laws are being considered in 45 states to curtail the right to peacefully assemble and protest. And they're doing that by expanding the definition of rioting, heightening the penalties for existing offenses, creating new crimes associated with any form of public assembly. And that's Arizona, that's Arkansas, that's Minnesota, that's Oregon, Oklahoma, Mississippi. I mean, there are laws in Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Florida that would give drivers the green light to, quote unquote, accidentally run over protesters who are preventing them from fleeing a riot. That's what's coming. And they're there. I mean, I teach them. I mean, I've taught both in the men and women's prison in New Jersey. They're there. But and they're not fooled by the Democratic Party, not for a minute. But they've been so effectively shackled. I mean, quite literally. So, I mean, August Wilson said it. I mean, the greatest black warriors in America are in prison because they tried to get for their family what their family needed when there was no other option. That is right. So I think we have to stand with those people, even if it's, if it appears to be utterly ineffective, because that's the only route. And you're right, we will be attacked. I mean, that's a good reason not to be on social media, which is why I'm not on social media. I'm not on Twitter. I don't have a Facebook page. There's a Twitter account, but somebody else runs it. I can't read Twitter. So we just have to stop caring what they think. We just have to stand. I mean, a $15 minimum wage. Imagine what that would have meant for for everyone, but for the white working class. That would have been to just turn on the Democratic Party when they betrayed that promise, would have been a statement. In fact, the left, by being so spineless, is essentially removing itself from the political configurations and only ensuring the rise of another demagogue, but this time probably a competent demagogue who won't, when they carry out a coup d'etat, mess up.
Well, that's what's so maddening about this whole thing, right? Because one is that they like to pretend that they don't have any power when they do. I mean, the progressive, I understand the broader point about the limitations of their power, but in this instance, you had an ability for 6 progressives in Congress to say, I'm not going to vote for the COVID relief bill unless it includes a $15 minimum wage. Now, there is an interesting moral question about whether or not one should take a stand like that holds up so much desperately needed aid for so many people in America. But obviously, the leverage comes from the fact that there are so many people in need and that there are political costs to being perceived as not allowing that to go through for the people who are blocking the minimum wage as well as the people who are blocking the bill because it doesn't include the minimum wage, right? It goes both ways. And there's no confidence from my perspective. There's no confidence in the public that the public will side with the people who want the minimum wage in the bill over the people who want the minimum wage out of the bill. And then the Democratic Party, as we've discussed in this program, did a lot of work to try to obscure the causality of why the $15 wage wasn't in the bill, really emphasizing the parliamentarian, emphasizing the role of Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, pretending like, palms aren't greased and deals aren't done and senators aren't persuaded ever, pretending like it's normal to have that kind of defection within parties, as opposed to convenient for Democrats to always have a foil to gum up the works that would prevent any structural change from actually happening, right? So all of this is going on. But at the same time, we do have a larger than ever number of genuinely unbought, grassroots funded Democrats, progressives, in Congress who did have the power in this moment to clarify the power dynamics, which are so often obscured in Congress. They don't do it. And now the left is in a position where it has to ask itself whether it's willing to make enemies of those people. I mean, I don't want to say make enemies because that's how they will characterize it, and it's absurd. But to frankly put pressure on those people. In a way that, go please, yeah.
I think what you're saying is if they don't do it, we got to do it. I don't look at AOC as an enemy. She's been bought. I mean,
Well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean when you say that?
Well, I think her heart is probably in the right place. I don't know her. I never met her. But I don't look at her as an enemy the way I look at, Tom Cotton or somebody, or Mitch McConnell as just, two of the most venal human beings who ever walked the planet, along with Trump and Stephen Miller, who looks like something out of a Bela Lugosi film. But I think we have to be clear in terms of our understanding of how power works, that these people have been emasculated, and they've shown it. They have decided that their political career is more important than confronting the monolith, and so they're not going to confront it.
Do you really think that's what's going on with,
completely.
with people like...
Yeah, Pelosi, these are, forget the public face. And I mean, I work for the New York Times, so I got a good look at what the inside of the machinery looks like. And these people are really vicious, vindictive figures who will destroy you if you cross them. So and AOC and everyone's figured that out.
So when someone like AOC says, I would rather be a one-term congressperson, this is what she's saying when she's running. I would rather be a one-term congressperson than to forsake my values. I understand over time, even someone like Biden who, wasn't, the grand scheme of Congress, didn't come from an affluent family, political family or anything like that. Once you're in there for 30, 40 years, yeah, you're invested. That's how you make your money. But someone like AOC, you're brand new. I as much as I'm characterized as like being antagonistic to her, I'd be willing to give her a lot more benefit of the doubt than most because she hasn't invested as much as a lot of other people in playing this game and staying in Congress. So that's part of why it's so confusing and frustrating when people like her, who just a year or two ago were saying, hey, I'd rather be a one-term congressperson than forsake my values. Why aren't we, it's ridiculous that Democrats haven't ever forced a vote on Medicare for all. Like she's literally just said those things within the past 24 months, is now not choosing to leverage her power. And is it just as simple as, I want to stay in Congress. I am enjoying this $170,000 salary. Yeah,
it's that, and also the belief that my being here is better than my not being here. I mean, they'll rationalize it.
See, I think that's more of it. I think that it's very easy to say, I am doing some good, a good deal of good, and then that's better than me not being here at all or being replaced by someone who's a lot worse.
Yeah, but she's powerless. Within the structure, she has no power at all. I mean, she has a media presence because Fox News gives it to her. They need a foil. They needed a foil for Trump. She was the foil.
Right. And the fact of a certain kind of independent democratized media, I would argue, you can say what you want about Twitter, but AOC has more Twitter followers than anybody in Congress.
Well, to quote Noam Chomsky, what can you really communicate over, 177 words or something?
Well, we got 240 characters now, so you can get a good little paragraph going.
Well, there you go. There it is.
But the idea is, if you're saying, though, Chris, if you're saying that the problem is nobody's calling for mass protest, and AOC has 14 million Twitter followers or whatever it is, and we have seen the demonstrated power of her sending out a tweet and collecting millions of dollars overnight and directing millions of dollars of aid and getting boots places. She can do that. So I don't think it's fair to say that just because these people don't have power internally. I agree with you. They don't have power internally, but that's why they should be using the power of the people.
But they won't because they'll be destroyed. They will end up. Bernie's not wrong. The machine will destroy them. I mean, look what they did to Cynthia McKinney.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a long list. That was largely over Palestine.
Right.
I mean, they're very unforgiving. I mean, you can just see example after example going all the way back to George McGovern. To 72, he gets the nomination. The Democratic leadership and the Republican leadership unite to destroy him. And then they take down his Senate seat. And he's out. He's finished. So she's figured the game out. And if she were to start calling for mass protests, they'd crush her. And she knows it, so she won't.
I guess I want to talk about that in more concrete terms, because I understand if someone has, your kid in a locked safe somewhere with a gun in their... I mean, like, obviously, that there's a level of coercion that I would expect everyone to cave in. But if we're talking about you don't get to be in Congress anymore, you get Ralph Nadered. You're a pariah. People are mean to you. I remember he came to speak in college my freshman year, and I was excited to go see him. And then he was getting booed. This was 2003, 2004. So, and he got booed, and it was a whole kerfuffle. Like I get that. I don't understand, given the stakes, I guess, why people care. I don't get why someone like Bernie Sanders, who's at the end of his political career anyway.
I never got that.
I don't. Can you tell us a little bit about you and your upbringing? Because I've heard you speak really compellingly about kind of where your ethics and your drive to keep pursuing these objectives, despite what happens to you professionally or what have you, where that comes from in terms of your upbringing and your father. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it comes from, I was raised in a religious household, but a very progressive religious household. My father was involved in the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and the gay rights movement in the 1970s. His brother was gay, my uncle. That was at a time when the church was very unforgiving for people talking about the right of the GBLT community to be ordained and married and have full rights. We just saw the Catholic Church walk back on this. And I watched him. He lost his job finally over that last issue. But I remember as a boy, people walking out of his sermons. I lived in an all-white farm town in upstate New York where Martin Luther King was one of the most hated men in America. And I don't think you can teach morality. I think you have to show it. And I watched it, and it was painful. I was very close to my dad. And I was just determined that I was not going to betray my father and everything that he stood for, no matter what. And that meant just standing unequivocally with people who were being oppressed, whoever they were, wherever they were. And when I was in seminary, I lived in Roxbury and ran a small church across from the Maine Mission Extension housing project and commuted every day into Cambridge to Harvard Divinity School. Well, that was a wake-up call as to what liberals were. People sitting around talking about empowering people they never met. And that's just, I spent 20 years in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East and the former Yugoslavia, and came back and went right into the prison program. And so I think the problem is that, we do have to have that kind of moral commitment to people who are being demonized and crushed by the ruling powers around them, and be willing to go down with them. And that's just a whole different way of looking at the world. It's not practical. There's nothing practical about it. I've done a pretty good job of, throughout my career, making myself more and more marginal. But I can live with myself. And you know what? I can walk in that prison and live with myself. I can go back to Gaza. And, I failed. But I was very outspoken against the call to invade Iraq. I lost my job at the New York Times for it. I never voted or supported anyone who embraced those wars. And I think as a white male, the best that can be said is that I've maybe earned the right to ask for their forgiveness. And that's just a different way of looking at the world.
Under Trump, resistance liberals would repeat the mantra, "This is not normal." That we all had an obligation to remind ourselves of this so we don't become the frog in a pot of boiling water as the country becomes more fascist. But as long as my adult life, I've seen domestic surveillance, endless wars in the periphery, military vehicles patrolling the streets, and recently, refugee kids in cages, COVID deaths, the Capitol being turned into a green zone, how these formerly abhorrent, unthinkable things have melted into the background of daily life. What is this process of normalization in your view, and how do we put an end to it?
Well, that is exactly the point, and it gets to the earlier Lenin quote of being as radical as reality itself. And you're right, it has been completely normalized and accepted, all of these forms of barbarity. And barbarity is the right word. I just can't get over the prison system. We drive by those prisons, many of us. And nobody ever asks what's happening to the inside. And so, yes, there is a kind of acclimatization to the horror. And that's dangerous. And I think that that has created the kind of political devolution that vomited up a figure like Trump. I watched in the dysfunctional Yugoslavia as these similar buffoonish figures like Radovan Karadzic or Franjo Tudjman or Slobodan Milosevic were all vomited up. That's what happens in dysfunctional societies because these demagogues, they give a voice to the hatred. Much of that anger, of course, is legitimate. They direct it in very self-destructive and socially destructive ways. But these demagogues are revered because they flout the conventions. They're outrageous. They're crude. They claim omnipotence, but most importantly, they call for war against the traditional elites that have betrayed the population. And all of the social conditions that you mentioned, coupled with the refusal on the part of the Democratic Party to address the social inequities, means that this rage is not only not going to go away, it's going to grow. And my biggest fear, and I really deeply hope I'm wrong, is that the only thing that's happening now is they're fertilizing the ground for a demagogue and an authoritarian system, at which point there's no turning back.
Could you elaborate on that point?
Well, I think that, what has been the response of the ruling elites? Well, I was opposed, by the way, to taking Trump off of social media because you're giving power to these amorphous entities, Facebook and Twitter and all these other YouTube, and to essentially erase people from the media landscape. Now, these entities are totally opaque. They know everything about us. We know nothing about them. We watched how they did things like lock the New York Post out of its own Twitter account when the New York Post published the information on the abandoned laptop by Hunter Biden. Even the New York Times is guilty of this. I mean, they used to refer, in the lead up to the election, they would refer to the Podesta emails as disinformation. That's not disinformation. They're real. Yep. Nobody's ever challenged the veracity of the Podesta emails. I'm also a strong supporter of Assange and WikiLeaks. I mean, there's just another one. I know Julian and I visited him in the embassy. I'm not going to ever vote for a Biden, given the fact that the Democratic Party persecutes my friend Julian as aggressively as the Republican Party. So, I think that we are seeing essentially an attempt. I just mentioned the kind of raft of laws that are being pushed through by the states to shut down peaceful protest, left or right, no matter where it comes from. We're seeing a very heavy censorship. We already have algorithms imposed. I'm hit with those algorithms to marginalize content on the internet. And so the ruling elites have made it clear that there won't be substantial reforms. What there will be is harsher forms of draconian controls. Biden has called for a new domestic terrorism law and censorship, and that is essentially laying the groundwork for a more formal and naked form of authoritarianism, probably centered around a demagogue.
Most people, I think, recognize the signs of civilizational decline that you've been writing about for the past few decades. And as we talk about on this show as well, polling data confirms that people by and large do want left-wing solutions. They do want to get profit they want decommodification, even if they're not going to call it that. They want profit out of things like healthcare, education, basic human needs. And something that you wrote, I think you wrote this, gave a speech about it, is that yet people are afraid. People are correctly afraid of ruling elites. How do people get shook out of that fear? When they know that this is wrong, they know we're on the wrong track, they're being fed spectacle from mainstream media, they're being sold new identities to replace an idea of politics. How do we short-circuit that system?
I think we short-circuit the system by understanding how the system works, but the system's never going to tell you how it works. So you're not going to get it from social media. You're not going to get it from images, most of which are corporate-driven. You're really going to have to go back to print. You're going to have to read the great writers on totalitarianism. Our great, we lost him a couple years ago, political philosopher Sheldon Wolin, in Democracy Incorporated, the writers Hannah Arendt. I think you have to read Marx. I'm not a Marxist, but Marx's analysis, along with Engels' great 1845 work, The Conditions of the English Working Class. I mean, you have to understand how capital works. You have to understand how systems of power work. And I do think that severance from a print-based society has hurt us. I wrote a book called Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. Totalitarian systems do spectacle very, very well. If you go back and look at the old radicals, Lower East Side and stuff, or look at the Black Power movements of the 1960s, including the Panthers, there was such a heavy degree of study. They read Franz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, and losing that ability to put our situation in context, to understand where we came from. And remember that the corporate state has a vested interest in historical amnesia, in keeping us rootless and not understanding. If we don't understand how we got here, we don't understand where we are. We don't understand why we are here. So, that's the old guy in me. I really think that we have to go back to these seminal texts. There isn't that kind of censorship because no one reads. You can still get all these books.
Mm-hmm.
They're there.
Another thing. Sorry, go ahead, Virgil.
No, you go ahead, Brie.
I was just going to say another thing you can get, and I think social media does facilitate this, is podcasts, the proliferation of these kind of conversations and YouTubes. And I'm not trying to be glib or self-promotional, but a lot of people know you and are able to hear you, and other people, the Ralph Nader and Richard Wolfs of the world, because you participate in forums like this. So, I for one, that's why I appreciate you coming here and talking to us, but also I wouldn't undersell the value of walking through some of that history. I've heard you talk in other contexts about, for example, the Powell memo and the purposefulness and the planning that went into creating the right-wing world we live in now, 40, 50, whatever years later. And I remember in law school when I learned about that was a real radicalizing experience for me, because it's one thing to say there's evil Republicans out in the world. It's another thing to say that this is a multi-decade plan that has come to fruition. And these are the kinds of things we're going to have to undo to get back to a more just world. Would you mind explaining, briefly if you can?
No, I think the podcasts and all of that, obviously I do them, and I think in that sense, the media, but it has to function more as a guide. Mm-hmm. You have to go read. You have to go read the Powell memo. Mm-hmm. You have to read. And so Richard Wolff and Cornel West and I a few years ago were in some despair and decided we would do a lecture every year based on a radical thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois, Gramsci, Rosa Luxemburg, in the hopes that it would give people a taste of these authors and send them back to their books. Mm-hmm. So I think that making people, that's why you teach in a classroom. You make your students aware of these thinkers and give them a sense of who they are and what it is they have to say. But there's no substitute for going back and reading them. And so, yes, I think that, but of course, the media platforms have constricted to such an extent. I have a show on RT America for which I'm roundly criticized. And my response is, if you don't like it, don't watch it. But it's a really wonky show. I don't know who would watch it. It's interviews with authors, because I know as an author, there's nowhere to go. And I always read the books. That show should be on public TV or NPR or something at 1 a.m. with some old writer interviewing other writers. But it isn't. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Right, and so I think you're right, but I don't think that can be a substitute for not being grounded in the print-based culture.
I think that's fair. I also think that there's people like No Name, who's a hip hop artist who has a radical book club that has gotten a lot of people into reading, radical left material that might not have if not for her social media presence and obviously her having a platform.
You're exactly right, and that is why it's worth doing. Yeah. But you want them to go read George Jackson,
I did want to. Sorry, go ahead, Virgil. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, I was going to switch gears, but if you ever follow me, you should go for it.
I was just going to pick up on something you said a little while ago, which was that that you read Marx, but you're not a Marxist. And I've heard you say that in other interviews. And with no dog in that fight, I'm just curious why you don't identify as a Marxist.
Because I don't believe in the solution. Marx is just a form of Hegelianism. He's replacing Hegel's idea of history. as the route towards inevitable human progress with the proletariat. I take a much darker view of human nature. I don't think human progress is in any way inevitable, nor do I think it's necessarily going to come from the proletariat, nor do I think the state is ever going to wither away. Nor do I think that industrialized societies, Marx, even the Bolsheviks, all thought everything was going to come from industrialized Germany. I didn't buy any of that. However, Marx's analysis of capitalism is, I think, unrivaled. And so the first volume of Capital is, I think, essential reading. And then 18th Brumaire, there's a lot of other Marx writings that are important. But Marxism is about a particular power system or a way to achieve power that I don't buy.
Well, this is a point that makes you one of the more heterodox thinkers on the left. Is it that do you believe in an essential human condition?
Yes. Do I believe? I don't think human nature changes. I think the tools change. But I think that's why you go back and read the ancient Greeks. I studied classics. And so you're talking about over 2,000 years ago, and they speak to you because there's an understanding, both within Greek drama and the Greek myths, as Freud understood, about the reality of human nature. And that's why the wisdom of the past is so important, because these great writers, these great artists, these great thinkers are grappling with the same kinds of issues. What makes the Greeks so interesting is they believe that moral dilemmas had to be played out in extreme circumstances. So you murder your father and marry your mother, kind of stuff. And I think that's right. So I don't believe that, unlike Steven Pinker and others, that we're perfecting ourselves or moving anywhere. I think that part of what's most important is, as Primo Levi and other writers have understood, is grappling with the evil within us. And I know, coming from war, that the line between the victim and the victimizer is razor thin. That, under the right circumstances, we can all become victimizers. And it's knowing that gives you a kind of protection. One of the things that's so frightening about the Christian right is that they externalize evil. Evil is embodied in the other, in the Muslim, in the non-believer who has to be eradicated. That's a very dangerous concept. So yeah, I'm with Conrad. I think that we have to guard against the evil within us, and it's all of us have it. And human nature is something that is a constant.
You've been a critic of the values of oligarchs who will gladly throw their principles overboard. Multiculturalism, due process, the old Enlightenment liberal values, if necessary to maintain their power. Does that presume then that there is another set of morals that should supplant what we could call liberal or neoliberal morality?
Well, we have to be clear about what liberalism is. Neoliberalism and liberalism are antithetical, of course. Neoliberalism is just unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. Ralph keeps saying, don't use the word neoliberalism. It's too confusing. But liberalism, and Chomsky's written the best about this, liberalism is a functional part of a capitalist democracy because it ameliorates the system. It acts as a kind of safety valve in moments of extremity to keep the capitalist system in place. And the classic example of that is Roosevelt. So Roosevelt understood that with the breakdown of capitalism, there was no jobs, then the government had to employ 12 million people, had to impose Social Security, had to lift the bans on labor unions. And as Roosevelt said, his greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. So the myopia of the ruling elites is that they didn't just destroy the radical movements, particularly starting in the early 1970s, after the uprisings in the 60s, but they destroyed the liberal institutions themselves, which are actually a fundamental part of keeping the balance of a capitalist democracy in place. And so, for instance, let's go to the minimum wage. If you go back to, I think it's since 1970 or something right around there, production has risen by 77%. And as the New York Times correctly pointed out, if the minimum wage had kept pace with production, the minimum wage today would be $20 an hour. but it was purposely suppressed and is still being purposely suppressed because debt peonage is such an important component of the profits gleaned by the predatory Wall Street speculators. And then they want that broken surplus labor. That's another, it's why they've made war on labor unions, because they're malleable. They can control them. So the destruction of liberalism, and I wrote a book on this called Death of the Liberal Class, and Clinton was really at the epicenter of this in the same way that Tony Blair was with New Labour in Britain, has been, I think, the root cause of our political and economic dysfunction. And there's a direct line from that assault to Trump.
So if you don't think that there's this kind of linear, inexorable, decline of capital that's coming, how do you think we get out of it? What is the solution, the non-Marxist solution that you anticipate?
Well, Marx was right about the late stage of capitalism, which is what we're in now. So what the late stage of capitalism, they hate markets. They build giant monopolies, Google, Facebook, Citibank, Bank of America, etc. And then they destroy, as Amazon. I mean, Amazon, has destroyed more small businesses than probably any other entity in the United States. They hate the free market. So they build monopolistic markets. They impoverish citizenries until they function as little better than serfs. And then, in order to continue their profit margins, they begin to cannibalize the state itself. That's Marx, and he's right. So that's where you get the privatization of healthcare, the privatization of education. 70% of our intelligence operations are outsourced to private companies like Bose Allen Hamilton. That's where you get whole mercenaries, Halliburton, Raytheon, Blackwater, I don't know what it's called now, Z or something. That is the late stage of capitalism. But by cannibalizing the host itself, you weaken the system tremendously. So there's a self-destructive quality. Karl Poignant, in his book, The Great Transformation, nails it. It's a look at what happens of deregulated capitalism. And he said what happens is you first create a mafia economy, and then you create a mafia state. And that's right, because you allow these entities to commodify everything. The human beings are commodities, the natural world is a commodity that you then exploit until exhaustion and collapse. And that's why the environmental crisis is twinned with the social crisis that we face.
I'm sorry. I gotta be a stickler for the solution bit.
Oh,
that's what we're all waiting for with bated breath.
He's very solutions oriented. I'm problem oriented.
I was trying to get out of that. I think the solution is to stop asking what the solution is and to start asking what the moral imperative is. For instance, to say, well, if you won't pass the minimum wage, then you have become my enemy. If you won't release 2/3 of the people locked up in our prison system, which is 25% of the world's prison population, 40% of the people in our prison system have never been charged with physically harming another person. I think we have to draw a line based not on the practical, because it won't certainly at the inception be practical. It may never be practical, but that's our only hope. And it comes for standing up for our values, standing up for what we believe in. And I watched, for instance, throughout the world, in Eastern Europe and everywhere else, how these principled figures stood up in Palestine, in Central America. I covered the war in El Salvador. In Eastern Europe with Václav Havel. Václav Havel was a non-person from 1977 when he founded Charter 77 until 1989. I was in the Magic Lantern Theater with Havel every night during the Velvet Revolution. He was not a good speaker. He wasn't particularly charismatic, but everybody knew he wouldn't sell them out. Now, when you don't sell people out, like Fred Hampton, assassinated by the FBI in Chicago, then they are frightened of you, as they were frightened of Hampton. 21 years old. They're out there. They're there. But those people who can't be bought, those people who actually hold fast to a moral imperative, they frighten the state.
Following up on that, and I think this could possibly serve as our last question. something you've written about is anomie, nihilism as consequences of our imperial decline. And as to what you just said about being guided by our moral principles, America is full of false prophets and false creeds. You wrote a book about one, and every single person in the Christian right thinks they're acting authentically with their moral principles. So just to reiterate the question, what moral principles should guide us?
Right. Well, that's a good question, because that's the difference between moral absolutism and morality as self-reflection. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I worship James Baldwin. I don't think you can understand America if you don't read Baldwin, fundamentally. I mean, not only, although, Baldwin grew up in the church too, his father was a minister. He said and he was a child preacher himself. He said he left the pulpit to preach the gospel. That's a Baldwin quote. But Baldwin, the power of Baldwin, like George Orwell, is that he had that moral core, but he was so hard on himself. And he was even hard on the black community. He was just fierce. He was such a fierce truth teller. And of course, I would argue, so incredibly prophetic. And so it's a matter of how you see yourself. And if you're a moral absolutist, then you see yourself as the embodiment of good. And that is very dangerous. But if you grasp a moral imperative, you're constantly struggling with your own capacity for evil, and it's there. I mean, Baldwin writes this devastating essay. After Martin Luther King dies, he has a suit, and it's a new suit, and he announces he won't wear it anymore. And he goes, and a friend of his who was still poor in Harlem, he grew up in Harlem, writes and said, well, give me the suit. And Baldwin just castigates himself for having lost touch with his own community. I mean, it's a really brilliant essay. You need that kind of constant self-criticism and self-reflection. That's the moral quality that I'm talking about, not the moral absolutism of the Christian right, which is a form of totalitarianism.
Chris Hedges, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Great. Thanks for doing it.
Where can people find you?
There is a Twitter account, Chris Lynn Hedges. It's run
But it's not you.
Well, but it's run by a really great guy, and he doesn't send out any personal messages from me, but it's all the articles and interviews that I do is on it.
At Chris Lynn Hedges. And where can people find your show?
It's on YouTube for now.
Until PBS picks it up.
There you go. That's right. So yeah, MSNBC. That's what I'm waiting for. Yeah, it's on YouTube, on Contact. Mostly, probably 70% are writers.
Well, thank you. We will definitely include links to those things in the show notes, and we appreciate. We're going to encourage everybody to read.
Okay, good. That's right.
We're going to keep reading ourselves, but we appreciate you bringing us the Spark Notes version of some stuff here as well.
No, that's important too. It's important too.
Well, thank you, Chris, and please do take care.
Not at all. Okay, thanks.